Hi, my name is Esther.
And I'm Debbie, pronouns they, them, and she, her.
And this is our podcast, Spirits Rising, where we question everything we've been taught about faith.
Listen to our unfiltered discussions with awesome guests as we explore liberating spiritualities true to our experiences. You may notice that this episode's sound quality is significantly better than previous episodes, and this is all thanks to our new Spirits Rising member, Dunc. Introduce yourself to the people, Dunc.
Hi. My name is Dunc. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently a Master's of Divinity Student at the University of Toronto, and I've got a background in literature and culture from Trent University. I've been working with audio equipment since I was like 12 years old, because I've been volunteering and then working for churches since that age. I've also worked with Trent Radio and the Anne Shirley Theater's company's audio drama rendition of the Laramie Project, both as an audio engineer and a cast member. And then I also have a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. It's called Folks Fables, and it's available on Spotify and all the good podcast listening apps. So if that tickles your fancy, then check it out, please.
So glad to have you on board, Dunc. I know that that you're acquainted with our guest today, Ariel Siagan. So yeah, do you want to tell us how you know Ariel?
Ariel and I got to work together on a community education project for a discipleship group at First Evangelical Lutheran Church. And that's currently where I'm working right now in tandem with the Student Christian Movement. However, Ariel is a SEM member, I believe, and a community member for First Lutheran. Yeah, he's absolutely incredible. He gave a brilliant presentation on Liberation Theology, specifically with a South American focus, which was absolutely beautiful. And, even as I had learned, in my first year of my master's program about Liberation Theology, I think in truth, Ariel taught me more than my profs did.
Whoa, that's big.
Yeah, I am so looking forward to talking with Ariel.
I really wish I learned more about liberation theology. Like, I've heard about it here and there, but I'm excited to talk to him too, because I want to hear a bit about it.
Yeah, what's really interesting is you kind of see the influences more and more, like the more you learn about it. It just kind of like you start to realize like, oh, we're actually already starting to implement these ideas. We just didn't have a name for it. Or like, oh yeah, it's like we were copying these people and obviously they were doing it intentionally and we just didn't know. Right? Like little things like that. Like, yeah, a lot of like faith and action stuff I think is very much focused around liberation theology without intending to be so.
Yeah. Even like the way that SCM does Bible study is very, very much liberation theology of MO. But yeah, I honestly still haven't read a lot of the theory. It just seems like I've absorbed a lot of things by osmosis. I hanging around people who have done that study, which is great.
That's my preferred method of learning. If I don't have to read anything and you just like tell me, or like, that's like preferred. Which is why I love this podcast, because I can just talk to people instead of having to read it on a paper.
Now I hope that I will get around to the reading.
I mean, yes, reading is good. Reading is good.
But if you can't get to the reading, a podcast is almost as good.
Ayo. Alright. So, soon we're going to be creating a video where me and Dunc will also be talking about what y'all want to see more of as we introduce Dunc into the podcast. So, let us know what you want us to talk about in future episodes, what episode you enjoy the most so far, and any other suggestions or comments that you may have.
Yeah, and if you want to send us any feedback, you can DM us on Instagram at SEM Canada or message SEM Canada on Facebook.
Our guest today is Ariel Siagan, Ariel is a doctoral student of theology at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He's also an ordained minister of the Iglesia Evangélica Metodista en las Islas Filipinas, or the Evangelical Methodist Church in the Philippines. Prior to coming to Toronto, he was a staff member of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, where he assists programs related to ecumenical and interfaith dialogue and Indigenous peoples' concerns. He currently chairs the newly established Filipino network in the United Church of Canada.
Ariel talks passionately about liberation theology, queer theology, and Philippine migration. Yeah, I know, like, now I know Ariel through First Lutheran, but even before that, I feel like I knew of you slash knew you because of, like, MRCC and iChirp, Anak Bayan, and it's really cool that now I know you through SCM. So we're just knowing each other through all these different ways, and I'm really thankful that you're here. Um, and yeah, my first question to you was going to be to ask how you got involved with First Lutheran, but apparently, as we were talking before, was that by me and I just didn't know, or did you already know First Lutheran before I suggested you join that group?
Uh, well, I heard, well, I had a personal, or Ralph Carl called me for a personal meeting through Zoom. And he said, you said that you are recommending me to be part of that group, which is okay. But I met Ralph Carl through Reverend Michael Blair. He introduced me to Ralph Carl, and Ralph Carl and I had lunch, and he introduced me to his church, what he's doing, what around around ministries with LGBTQI folks. So yeah, I arrived here September of 2019, and the meeting probably happened beginning of October 2019. So yeah, we started communicating, and Ralph Carl invited me to one of the event he was organizing. I was part of the anniversary of uh, Lutheran is the talks between Lutheran and Catholic Church, and we had a great service in First Lutheran Church. That's my first activity done with Ralph Carl.
So I actually didn't know this about you. So does that mean you identify religiously as Catholic, or would you like identify with any denomination?
I'm I'm evangelical Methodist. That's where I grew up. I'm very ecumenical. I work with the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. But yeah, my root, my faith was informed, shaped by evangelical Christianity in the Philippines. So mostly conservative.
I am curious about that because I know for me personally, I was also raised in like a Filipino evangelical church, but it was very conservative. But now I know you do a lot of like liberation theology and activism, and I'm curious about how you feel your faith now informs how you see social issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's there are pivotal moments in my life that I shifted from one form of Christianity to another form of Christianity. And this type of Christianity I am engaged with right now is I mean there's a lot of activism in there. I would say my activism started when I got involved with the work of the Kalipunan ng Kristiyanong Kabataan sa Pilipinas, or in English it's the Christian Youth Ecumenical Movement in the Philippines, because I was then a youth leader of our denomination. My initial involvement is more of a response to an obligation rather than a wholehearted voluntary participation, since our denomination is a member of this whole ecumenical movement, mostly led by the National Council of Churches. So at the beginning, I'm telling the story now. At the beginning of my participation, I was just um, what's that? Half-hearted, indifferent. I was just representing our denomination. I was actually warned by the people in my denomination to be careful whenever I am with this group of activists, because they are activists and they fight the government. I should be very careful about participating with them. So I was a good soldier back then. I took their advice, but then this antipathy and indifference would take a major 180-degree turn the when this group of ecumenical young people hold what we call peace camp. Because one of the activities in this peace camp is to be immersed in an urban poor community and peasant communities. I was assigned to be immersed in an urban poor community and to visit a political prisoner in a prison cell in Cavite, south of Manila. So on day two of the camp, we went to a jail. I was surprised that the political prisoner is actually a pastor of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. His name is Berlin Guerrero. Yeah, from the UCCP. We sat down with him together with other young people. We listened to his story, and he was with his wife. And the story was that he was with his wife and three children when Berlin Guerrero was abducted. They were on board in a tricycle, or you know what a tricycle is, DV, yeah. Or in Thailand, it's called tuk tuk. It has um, three wheels run by a motor. So
Motorcycle.
yeah, motorcycle, three-wheeled motorcycle, because it has a
Like a
yeah.
sidecar, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. Like a sidecar. So when military armed men blocked their way, they poked their guns on them and forced Pastor Guerrero in one of the vans. He said that as a pastor, Pastor Berlin Guerrero told us that as a pastor, one of his work is to organize people around certain issues. And in his immediate context, one pressing issue is the demolition of urban poor housing uh, in, in the community where he served as a pastor. And the demolition of urban poor housing is due to the pressure made by big businesses to build malls and expensive condominiums without extending assistance of relocation from the government. So this has made him a target. Back then, he chairs the people's movement called Bayan in provinces south of Manila. So there's a lot of although he works in the church, he is very engaged in people's movement. And because of that, he was red tagged. He was identified as a nuisance to the government. And that led to his abduction. His family, who witnessed the abduction, didn't know where the band will be heading. So uh, they were afraid. Initially, they were afraid that this will be another case of desaparecidos. He will not be surfaced, and they will just find the body somewhere else. But Berlin Guerrero, after the pressure of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines and international clamor for him to be surfaced, he later surfaced at a prison in Cavite, and it was reported that he was tortured. It struck me as a church person, as I am since I was a child, to hear horror stories such as this. I realized I was too comfortable in my church and in my church activities. I was so struck by what I heard, especially the torture part. It really wrenched my heart during that time, and I wanted to know more because of that. So I searched more and found videos that reenacts Pastor Berlin's torture, and I found them on YouTube at that time. I'm not sure if it's available right at the moment, but I remember. I remember being moved because the torture happened to a church person. So the images and sounds were gory and too violent, and the government of then President Gloria Arroyo, I mean, that revealed that um, even even the prohibition in international laws of the use of torture, it's still being used by many of governments around the world, including our president back then, Gloria Arroyo, used to use torture to their perceived enemies. So, my participation to the ecumenical youth movement has never been the same again after that immersion. It was for me the experience of Soul on the Road to Damascus. I was changed and found myself burning with passion to learn more and to do more about marginalized communities and to participate in efforts waged by church movements to struggle with those communities, and that would mean against the status quo or the government in the Philippines. So that was the most I think that was the most pivotal moment in my faith journey, where I question my own comfort versus the struggle other church people are doing in order to make life better for the marginalized groups. Pastor Berlin Guerrero was invited to apply for refugee status by the Uniting Church in Australia. So the family is safe there now, and doing organizing church work around Filipino communities in Australia. I'm not sure if he's aware of if I'm not sure if he's aware of me, but he made a lot of difference in my faith journey.
Maybe he'll listen to this and then he'll know. I actually do want to make a comment because I think for me, just coming into my early 20s and just being aware of all these things that are happening in the Philippines and the things that clergy are facing, I think I was under a false impression that I'm of right now being in the Duterte administration and think like, oh, it's like, oh, Duterte does this, Duterte does that. But you saying, oh, the past presidents use these torture methods, it's like, this is not a new thing. This is a thing that's been happening and maybe is more popular now in Canada with the news because of Duterte's character, but it's not new at all. So thanks for sharing those stories. It's very insightful.
Yeah, where my thoughts were going is that here, as the SCM in Canada, we often like to think of ourselves as radical, but really, SCMers and other progressive people in the Philippines are, risking their lives to advocate for justice. And yeah, I would, yeah, I would love to hear a bit about your experiences of the faith narratives, the practical theologies um, that have guided people towards such committed political action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's my that's a good point because my my research would be focused on an underground church movement in the Philippines. It's not the typical church where they gather every Sunday. It's more of a uh, clergy clergy and some lay leader people uh, gathering. They call themselves Christians for National Liberation, and they are underground. I mean, they can be politically persecuted. If you're a member, you can be politically persecuted. Um, and it was founded during the martial law years under President Ferdinand Marcos. So that would be my research focus, and that includes your question of how do they make practical that theology that they believed in, and mostly, although not entirely, mostly they believed in and what they practice is what we call the liberation theology. Um, an interesting aspect of what they believe in is the use of violence to effect social transformation. We could talk a lot about the use of violence, but um, for now, how they exercise their faith in relation to social issues is that they are uh, they still participate in the church. They are priests, they are pastors, they are ministers, they are deaconesses, but still their agenda is on forwarding the revolution in the Philippines, meaning they participate in what you call armed struggle uh, in the countryside, especially in the countryside, and mobilizing church resources and mobilizing church people to attend protest rallies. That's how it became practical, and yeah, um, yeah. So that's how it became practical for them and concrete. Mm-hmm.
I just want to say, like, I think in North America, or at least in Canada and the U.S., it's very common to see conservatives saying like, "Oh, we're being persecuted for our faith because um, we believe in things and or counterculture or whatever," but really that's not like that's not they're not really being persecuted, right? And then when I hear stories like the ones you're saying, it's like, no, those are really like stories that remind me of the Bible, of people being persecuted for their faith and what they believe in. So those that's very powerful to hear.
Yeah, I will share this observation, but it's I'm not entirely sure if this will be correct, but I think Canada's reached a certain point of consciousness where uh, your government listens to people, although that's very relative. While in the Philippines, while in the Philippines, your life is at stake if you're if you're uh, a critic of of the government. So people tend to be more um, aligned to the government, to the especially to the populist government. Um, they are more aligned to that because the government mobilize, issue, deploy the use of violence against their people in order to get their alliance or to get in order to win over them. But it's not right. I mean, it's not right that you are forcing people to be on your side because you are threatening them of violence.
Mm. Yeah. Even with like relatively quote unquote good things, like for example, I believe that if you're able to get vaccinated, people should be vaccinated. But I read an article the other day where Duterte was like, if you're not gonna get vaccinated, I'm gonna throw you in jail. And he literally word for word was like, and I'm gonna inject your buttocks with a vaccination. Like I will force you. And that imagery, that like the yeah, like it's what you're saying, like just forcing people to do what you want to do rather than like education and allowing people to have free thought is not right.
Yeah, he said a lot of things to threaten to threaten people to to or to threaten people and therefore to silence the people, uh, which is producing a lot of trauma. Um, yeah, we can go to we can go to the direction of Duterte, but I think it's also important your questions around faith and social issues.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that we could we could keep on going with how terrible Duterte is, but that feels like an easy. That feels almost too easy. um, yeah, I'm. Yeah, are there? Are there other things that we want to touch on before we kind of shift to the questions we have about um, about kind of your advocacy for Filipino migrants in Canada?
Mm. Or what really struck me uh, browsing through your questions was the connection between faith and social issues. Uh, and Probably I can share something about the SEM in the Philippines and how other ecumenical youth organizations are doing mutual aid and justice.
That that would be cool. I mean, I have been hearing really neat things about the SCM in the Philippines organizing mutual aid at considerable risk, given the kind of lockdown restrictions that the government is imposing.
So yeah, my at this point of my faith journey, I actually feel lesser constricted, lesser feeling of dissonance, and feeling more coherent in terms of my relationship of the relationship of my faith to social issues. Because the relationship between faith and social issues are not as direct as it may seem, although we try to connect them when we when we post social media, when we post things on social media, uh, we we as if there's a direct connection between faith and social issues. Well, in while in the dominant framework of things, it's hardly it is. I mean, in the mind, a lot of processes is happening when one try to find connection between faith and social issues, right? So connecting the dots is not as easy as it looks like, and drawing the connection between the two takes a lot of intentionality, and learning, willingness to listen and silence the self, which is formed and created by the dominant church pattern or dominant church teachings, and also the willingness to question and critique our own belief and the whole belief system in which it is placed. So for me, the faith formation I had was from an evangelical Methodist church, more on the side of conservatism rather than progressivism. Definitely not liberal. Um, and Looking from that lens of conservative evangelical Christianity, the poor are objects of mission. So we go to poor areas, although we are poor by ourselves. We go to poor areas, poor communities, and try to convince people from there of our prescription for salvation. And that would mean that salvation is accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior and having them to attend our church and them becoming part of our community. While, of course, that perspective is not entirely wrong, yeah, I would say that it's not entirely wrong, but it misses to consider the reasons why poor becomes poorer and the rich gets richer, and in a way, that kind of faith has become a way to numb oneself of suffering and not to feel pain or even deny the pain of others and deny the presence of pain in other people's bodies or communities. While the idea of heaven and eternal life can really function as comforting blanket in a poverty-stricken community, but really when we say in prayer that Lord, may your kingdom come, we are asking that heaven becomes really in here and in the now. And when we ask God for eternal life, we actually are asking for the eternal life to begin at that moment we ask for it and not begin eternal life after our death. So it is not easy to find the connection, to be honest. As I've said, one has to be intentional about it, and sometimes one has to be born again into it before really having that coherent connection between faith and social issues. That is because, for one, faith has been used by the status quo silence the people. And when I say silence the people, we see, I personally heard of stories of missionaries coming to indigenous people's community in the Philippines, missionaries coming from from North America, going mostly evangelical Christianity, Pentecostal Christianity, going to urban poor communities with the intention to form church without asking the ecumenical bodies, and mostly their intention is to propagate the good news, and that's good intention, but it also point to the fact that uh, the status quo is intentional in silencing the people by pointing them to heaven, numbing them of their pain, in order to in order that the status quo will proceed, or the government will proceed with what they have to do, mostly exploiting workers, mostly not changing the way things are, like agrarian land reform in the Philippines hasn't been really great. I mean, there's not a lot of changes with in terms of distributing land to farmers, and uh, the minimum wage in the Philippines is grossly low. Uh, so those things, mostly the Christian faith that is introduced and popular in the Philippines, are not subversive to to the the government, but uh, helping to maintain the uh, helping to maintain the current setup of things. And the current setup of things is not at all transformative, uh, not at all helping the people to really uh, gain the fullness of life, but it's actually contradictory to it. So I'm not gonna lie, I gone through some period of confusion myself, actually. Some say liminal period, and when the dissonance is so loud in my head, so I question the relevance of my faith in my life, question if God really exists. I gone through all those things because because of my experience of Pastor Berlin Guerrero as a prisoner. I I went through some period of liminality. Liminality is such a term right now, but or maybe uh, it's an old post-colonial term by Homi Baba, or at least popularized by Homi Baba. Uh, so yeah, so I've been through that period of liminality, questioning the relevance of my faith, question if God really exists, as I was told, questions about the church and its meaning. What do they, what do they do in the face of tremendous suffering? And to be totally honest, I came to a point when I would not be ready to give up, or I would be very much ready to give up my faith, give up my belief in God, give up God Himself or herself or themselves. Uh, give up prayer time, devotion time, all those things that I learned from the church growing up. All those things that all those activities that I learned to love because that's what my family told me to be, and that would bring me closer to God, and that would make me successful. Uh, at least that those were all their claims, and those things that I learned to love while growing up. It was a long period of dissonance. I would not claim that I have resolved all the contradictions that exist in my head. And that is probably the reason I'm doing doctoral research around the concepts of liberation theology and social movements and the use of violence to achieve social transformation. Yeah, so have you experienced those dissonance?
That that feels like that really feels like a point of connection that it seems that pretty much everyone that I meet through SCM from nearly anywhere um, seems to share that experience of kind of deconstructing essentially colonial theologies and discovering liberation theology and reconstructing a new faith, essentially. So yeah, I'm curious about kind of um, who's supported you in that kind of process of reconstruction.
For one, when I hear loud voices of dissonance, which is constricting in my head, when I experience those, I observe that it is silence whenever. I mean, the dissonance I am hearing in my head is silence whenever I involve myself in social justice issues or social justice
Mm.
work. I probably could claim that I found God there in the middle of the struggle around those activities that challenges the powerful or the status quo. I think I felt God closer to me when I attend the rallies with urban poor communities or farmers that demand dignified housing and access to food, and all those activities were mediated by my participation with the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, and yeah, the National Council of the NCCP has been a big part of my faith journey because they have been doing work among and with the marginalized communities in the Philippines. The faith that they were trying to promote and build uh, is faith formation around the issues of suffering in most of the people in the
Mm.
Philippines. I would say it's grounded uh, and not ivory tower theology, if you know what I mean. It's grounded uh, that the process of doing theology or constructing belief system begins with the experience of suffering of the people, and that's what makes for them that's a starting point of doing theology, the suffering of the
Mm.
people, rather than the dominant process of theology, which begins theologizing from the perspective of tradition or from the perspective of the dominant traditional way of interpreting the Bible. And this is a new, not really new, but this is something is liberating, because when you begin the process of your theology from the ground, meaning from the experience of the people, it faith becomes more relevant,
Mm.
and faith becomes more real and experience, rather than the meta reality that is imposed by traditions, or the meta reality imposed by the teachings of the church, which was constructed long time ago,
Mm.
and which was constructed on a land that is not really uh not really relevant to the situation of suffering, for example, in the Philippines or majority of the
Mm.
people in the world.
I kind of want to echo and just like support what y'all were saying about the feeling of dissonance and everything. Like 100%, it's something that I still go through as well. And even in having left the church I grew up in, and then trying to find my footing and like, okay, what does a church community look like for me now? And I really like what you said, Ariel, about how your faith is formed through on the ground stuff that you end up doing, and as you start working more in those activist roles, because I remember even in my old church I would still feel God's preferential option for the poor and all those things, and try to implement things in my old church of like, okay, how can we help actually do real work and help? And then after trying things like that a few times, I started to realize, okay, this church is not doing the work that I feel like needs to be done. Like they are so concerned with
Mm.
um, the rhetoric is like obedience to the Bible and like
Mm-hmm.
doing like following the word and those types of like, I would call them kind of like controlling methods. And um,
Mm.
so yeah, I really resonate with everything you just said.
it's very Filipino to be conservative, especially because uh, especially here we are placed in a marginalized situation. So the call for the day is, I mean, the call is to obey rather than question, uh, because I mean, also in the Philippines we're survival mode, always on a survival mode. Uh, Meaning you cannot afford to question the powerful uh, because you're eating from their hands, uh, and uh, and that if you question the powerful, it would mean danger in many different ways. So yeah, um, I I would while I totally, I mean, while I mean, it's not totally disagreeable that the trajectory of things are that, because we are informed by fear. We also have to, step up or overcome that in our consciousness, and ask ourselves, um, if this is really transformative from the perspective of those who suffers or those who are marginalized. I found that, you know going back to my faith journey, uh, it's it's really a process of overcoming one's own self consciousness. You know, and overcoming is not an easy process. If especially if it's yourself you're overcoming. Uh, I mean, it's a lot of systems in your head, or frameworks in your head, that you would have to say that's not good, and that's not helping me, and this framework is not totally true. And this motivation, the fear you get because people say it's disobedient, because people say, or your church mate will say, that will bring you to hell, and that is not right, then that is shameful. You really have to overcome those constructs in your head, motivated by fear, to be really functioning in a liberating or liberated consciousness. Um, and one of the ways that I find helpful to overcome the deep and the strong, how do you call that, cognitive frameworks in my mind, is to participate in rallies, in education sessions. In rallies, actually, in the Philippines, are opportunities for to be educated. Rallies are made to be are designed that uh, the voices you will feel on the rally stage are not highfalutin theories, not highly regarded theologians, but who will you hear when you attend rallies in the Philippines are those people who are firsthand experiencing the violence of the state. So you will hear people from the urban poor communities, urban poor leaders, farmers, coming from different regions in the Philippines. They will say their experiences, and that's their experiences will, of course, will when you hear them and you attend to their voices, um, you will be changed. That's I think what happened to me. I feel I I attend rallies. I'm not ashamed of that. I feel that um, I feel God closer to me when I attend rallies with urban poor communities or farmers that demand dignified housing and access to food. And I feel that heaven is nearer when I see that, in rallies we burn effigies of our politicians. I feel hope viewing the burning of those effigies. Because the burning of, because every time we, especially during State of the Nation address, so every, I think, on an annual basis, the President of the Philippines has to deliver um, uh, State of the Nation address. So, and that is being held um, in uh, in what they call Batasang Pambansa, or where all the representatives of the nation is converging. But the People's Movement in the Philippines is doing the same event outside that powerful hall. So the nation of the state, the State of the Nation report of the president is, of course, from their own perspective, the politician's perspective, and the one that is being done by the people's movement is from the perspective of the poor. So it's like a story counter story, narrative and then counter narrative. And of course, I would listen to counter narrative because it is our obligation to listen to the victims. And every time every time the rally ends, there's an effigy burning, and it's for me the highlight of the highlight of rallies, because it's symbolic, it's powerful, it has a lot of meaning. It produces a lot of meaning even beyond the intention of those who are burning the effigies. So for me, it symbolizes and enacts the dawn of newness, and the end of corruption. That's why, for me, it inspires hope. I know burning is bad for the environment, certainly, but it's the subaltern's way of expressing discontent, I think, and that's what makes it meaningful for me. And I feel, God in the church, of course, but the presence of God in these rallies and marches that I attended with marginalized sectors is overwhelming and great. Maybe God is in the church, but God is also with his people. Even though it's not a theological activity. I mean, attending rally is not a theological activity. It's not something that uh, that that in the traditional way of things is churchy. But you'll be surprised. I know you've seen this DV in the Philippines. You see clergy in their uniforms marching, nuns wearing their what's this? Yeah, and some Muslim wearing their hijabs. Faith communities participating in these rallies. So God is there. I mean, God is among the poor people. God is among the brokenhearted. So why not appreciate the presence of God in that environment? Even we don't usually associate the presence of God in that kind of environment, and we associate it with big cathedrals, uh, hill songs. Uh, the presence of God is also among the voices, the outcry of those who are uh, experiencing suffering in those places. So there were times in the history, in my personal history, as I attend those rallies, I found myself quivering to my bones and sometimes in a state of release from emotional distress. Uh, and rallies and marches became to
I
me a new
I
way of
totally
doing
want to read
church.
a paper
Yeah, so
about
yeah,
rallies as liturgy.
yeah,
You know what's so interesting too? Are you going to the Pisona on Sunday, Ariel? At Bathurst and
yes,
Wilson?
yes.
SCM
Yeah,
is
I was
speaking
about
at
to.
that one too. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, Anak Bayan is an organization in Toronto, and I think they're organizing the People's State of the Nation address at Bathurst and Wilson, and they reached out to us and they were like, Divi, can SCM like give a little 2-minute talk there? So it's so interesting that you're saying like rallies are church to a degree, and I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, that's because it's the State of the Nation address in the Philippines. Uh, so it's this event that will happen on Sunday. is a parallel event uh, of the people's movement in the Philippines. So here we tell counter narratives. Here we have to tell uh, that the perspective of the president or of the powerful is not definitely not correct, because here's the counter narrative, here's the truth, here's our truth, and that counters your truth, and that I mean that our testimony, the testimony of the marginalized communities, the people abroad in diaspora who were forced to migrate because there's no jobs in the Philippines, and because it's not enough to live sustainably in a company where they only pay you minimum wages, and the prices of stuff in the Philippines goes higher and higher every day, and the taxes is the same. So so to do a counter narrative, to dispute the claim of the president or of the powerful is uh, is an act that is responsible, moral, and necessary. Uh, because how do you counter lie? Yeah, you have to tell the truth, and the truth comes from the perspective of comes from I mean as the truth doesn't belong to the powerful. The truth belongs
If we
to the
can
marginalized
pivot
community.
a bit here, that one of one of the things that you've been doing since arriving in Canada is calling on um, calling on the mainline churches, um, who like to think of ourselves as very progressive, but include a lot of very privileged people who are benefiting from the exploitation of migrants. Um, so you recently co-produced a video and wrote an article for the United Church of Canada website calling on church members to act in solidarity with Filipino migrants. And I was curious in particular about a phrase that was presented quite prominently in the video, which was hardship discrimination. And yeah, could you explain a bit about what's meant there?
Mhm. Yeah. I think
Okay.
I think it was just the missing comma rather than rather than rather than it was meant to be shown for Asian Heritage Month. So I co-produced it with a pastor from he did all the videos uh, with a with an Taiwanese pastor, a very good friend of mine, EB. Um, we
Okay.
just I didn't see it actually in the video, but I think we just missed a comma there. But yeah, they're
That's so funny.
producing. I mean, contrary to the Filipino belief that when we go here, we achieve what we call the American dream, like a good life, a work balanced life. It's and I mean that's the lure of going to America or going to North America, and the experiences of many here in Canada. I don't have the numbers on hand, but there's a counter narrative to the to the to that idealist thinking that when people arrive here in Canada, they or even in other first world countries, they kind of achieve the American dream and they are living comfortably, and that they are well off or became well off, that they have a lot of money. That's just an impression, while in reality, many are experiencing exploitation, um, there's a lot of documentaries around the Filipino Asian communities, in agricultural communities in Ontario and in different parts of Canada. They were not, I mean, housing for them is not as, I mean, they're not given they're not given housing, which is of course necessary or basic. Plus, plus sometimes they're being they experience uh, not receiving salaries, and there are also reports that they are threatened whenever they don't do the job properly, that they will be sent back to the Philippines, and those are emotionally. I mean, I think I've seen some reports, and I've heard firsthand experiences of people being threatened to go back to their countries, and I could only imagine that kind of uh, emotional experience they going through, because it's not easy to come here. It takes a lot of it takes a lot of um, time, effort, and money to process your visa. So you have to pay for the visa, and the visa fee is horrendous. And especially if you think of especially if you're not earning Canadian money or any kind of money outside from the Philippines, it's no joke to produce those kinds of money. Even the plane cost of going here, it's horrendous. And when you receive threats that you will be sent back home, it's emotionally crippling. uh so it's I think while some people in Canadian society is doing that, I'm not sure if they are aware of its emotional repercussions, especially to those migrant people who went here not because they wanted to uh, not because they wanted to go here for tourism. They are here because they are forced to migrate, and there are the factors that I mean the the pool the pool factors that bring them here includes not having a secure job in the Philippines, and not having and not having that job that will sustain them. For example, if one in the family got sick, the money that you are receiving from your company will not be enough to sustain someone who got sick. And and of course you wanted to put food on the table, you wanted a dignified house, uh, and the jobs in the Philippines are not giving you that. So it's forced migration. And when one is threatened to, we when one is threatened uh, to that they will be sent back home, it's really an emotional turmoil for someone who is thinking of his family, who is the breadwinner in the family. The family's looking for him to sustain them
Yeah,
because living in the Philippines has not been
that's something
so
I
sustainable.
really think Canadians need to come to terms with. It's just how completely exploitative the temporary foreign worker program is in particular. I mean, the whole principle of it is that it's bringing people to Canada to do work at wages that are not enough to live in Canada, um, and to and here, yeah, people are being promised a chance at a better life when that's not the employer's plan at all.
So, if it's all right with you, I want to unfortunately move on to our last question that we have for you. Um, And it's kind of funny because the last set of questions I have for you are actually questions that you wrote for an article. And it's the same article that Esther was talking about. So you pointed out some questions in the United Church of Canada article about how churchgoers and clergy should and could be good stewards and do the work that God calls us to do. So you asked the questions: do the dynamics of our church policy and programming enable us to host and provide safety for migrants, or are they hostile to them? And what can we do to foster safe space and belonging? And I want to know what your answer to this question would be. So, how would you answer that question?
Uh, I have two models in mind. I I haven't written. I did not write any answer to this question. But in my mind, I know of two models. When I was in Korea, because there's big language barrier there. There are I pastor a Filipino community in South Korea. We were not integrated in the Korean church because Korean church hold their service in Korean, um, and uh, and the Filipino community can speak in English, and we have one Punjabi community, one Pakistani community, one Mongolian community, all are separated in, but belonging to a one local congregation. So that's one model. I think it works. Uh, I haven't, while here in Canada, I haven't seen a church like uh, that has one congregation and it has several several things around that. So I actually don't know what's how to answer this question. But I know for sure that if you let the people, the newly arrived migrants, to be themselves, to give them spaces uh, to to be their own culture, to practice what they to practice the kind of spirituality and the kind of church they wanted to have. You give them spaces for that, facilities, um, even give up your own leadership, or give up the leadership of the church in order that others will find themselves in leadership position. Uh, I mean that would be powerful. That would be a powerful witness that you are integrating them in the formal structures, and at the same time, uh, you let them become what they are. I think, yeah, I think that's important. Uh, I think the trajectory is that migrant church communities would want to have a church of their own. I think they wouldn't want to be included in a very structured polity church kind of thing. Uh, that's because they wanted a share of power, and they wouldn't want, and I mean, they wouldn't get it in a situation where the church is highly structured, where people are leading the congregation since the beginning of time. Migrants would want a share of power, and they would exercise it if they form their own church and congregation. What the main, I mean, I think what the main, I should write a paper on this to parse some information in my mind. But I think power dynamics is important in looking through this migrant and church stuff. I think migrant church needs to experience a kind of power sharing, and they wouldn't want to be in a structured church. I think that's the trajectory is, and and it's not about refusal to be integrated in the main society, but it's more of it's more of understanding what church is, and uh, church is also about sharing of power. So I mean, I'll end to that before I before I say other unthoughtful unthoughtful comments.
I do appreciate that answer for sure. Like, it reminds me of my home church, and it was mostly Filipinos, but then the pastor was like from an American who's been in Singapore and had that like American Singaporean church hierarchical model. And I remember there was a point in the church of great uh divisiveness where there was discussion about how Filipinos should speak less Tagalog in church because the people who couldn't speak Tagalog, yeah, were starting to feel left out. And that was a whole thing. And one of our elders in the church who was Filipino, she made a comment that I found really powerful. And she said, we've been in this church for 15 years, mostly Filipinos, and we've always spoken to Tagalog, and it's never been a problem until you have now told us that we shouldn't speak Tagalog, and this is causing divisiveness. So she was like, which one is more divisive? The fact that we're speaking another language, or the fact that you're actually trying to make us stop, which is making us more divisive? And it's true, like trying to assimilate people into churches, especially when they're the majority. That's what's insane to me, is you're trying to get them to be very honestly, the only term that comes to mind is whitewashed, and act a certain way and assimilate and not bring their culture in with them. That's definitely not the way to do it. So I like how you mentioned putting them positions of power. I feel like that's a good answer.
I have a lot to say more about SEM in the Philippines and how faith and political
Yeah,
activism is
we
connected.
also might
But
be
probably
doing
we can talk about it at
doing
a
an
later
episode
time.
at some point with SCMers in the Philippines. So
Most of my profound, meaningful, even romantic relationships were
Tell
were
us
yeah,
the tea.
this seems to be a universal fact of
were
the
from my
SCM.
friends from the SEM.
Oh. Oh my. That's amazing. There's so much more we could talk about, and hopefully we'll have more of these discussions with you in the future. We've been take that in. We've been talking for over an hour. I don't know how much we'll cut this down, but I've learned so much today already, like about liberation theology, the idea of the counter narrative to Sona. Because I knew about P-Sona, but I didn't frame it that way, as like a counter narrative. And also just hearing you talk about the experiences of clergy in the Philippines. All like this episode was just super transformative to me. So thanks for sharing all that. All of your experiences was great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Spirits Rising. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, and all your favorite podcasting apps. Our thanks to the Student Christian Movement for supporting this project, and especially to the SEM York's partnership with St. Theodore of Canterbury Anglican Church and the Diocese of Toronto's REACH grant.